Excellent. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I am so delighted to see you all here today joining us for our first lecture. It truly feels powerful to gather in a room where ideas, justice, and community come together. This is the launch of our brand new Women and Gender Studies Spotlight series. The WGS Spotlight series will be a monthly gathering where we will highlight the work of scholars, activists, artists, and community leaders who are shaping conversations about gender, conversations about sexuality, conversations about race, power, and justice. Think of it as both a celebration and also an invitation. A celebration and an invitation to learn, to reflect, and to engage. For those who I haven't met yet, I am Nermeen Alam. I direct the Women and Gender Studies program here at Rutgers, Newark. It is a true joy to open this series with Professor Vanessa LeBue. Today, we open the series with an event titled The Emotional Life of the Child. The lecture is about childhood emotional development, how babies, how young children, how they learn to read faces, how they learn to read voices, and how they learn to read feelings. The way we teach and transmit emotions, as Vanessa is going to teach us, is deeply gendered. This labor of emotional caregiving, so often invisible, so often taken for granted, and so often coded as, quote, women's work. This labor of emotion of care giving is essential to how children grow into socially and emotionally capable people. We are so fortunate to have with us Professor Vanessa LeBeau, an extraordinary developmental psychologist here at Rutgers, Newark. Her research explores how infants and young children, how do they perceive and interpret the emotional world around them, and how the caregiving they receive, especially from mothers, how it shapes their emotional knowledge and social well-being over time. It is the kind of work that bridges psychology, family, and the gendered realities of everyday life. Without further ado, I will turn it to Vanessa. Again, it's such a pleasure to have you opening up our series. She will share her insights with us for the next 30 minutes, and we will have some time for questions and comments from the audience. Vanessa, please.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So my name is Vanessa LeBeau. I am a professor of developmental psychology in the psychology department at Rutgers, Newark. I'm also currently chair of the department. And I study very broadly emotional understanding. Now, emotion understanding is the set of abilities related to determining the emotions of others, and it's crucial for the development of healthy social interactions. And this includes emotion perception, the way we perceive the emotions of others, emotional expression, how we express emotions ourselves, and emotion regulation. And, emotion understanding as a whole, this set of skills allows us to respond appropriately to others' needs, make predictions about social interactions, and even regulate our own emotional responses effectively. And why do we care about emotion understanding? Well, children with better emotion understanding have better outcomes. They are rated as more socially skilled by their teachers. They're rated as more likable by their peers, and they're better able to navigate tenuous or aggressive interactions. And children with poor emotion understanding tend to have more negative outcomes. They tend to be more aggressive with their peers. They tend to present with more internalizing problems like anxiety and depression, and they demonstrate lower academic achievement. So, this is a set of skills that is really important for children and adults' social functioning. So, my question is, how do we get from a newborn baby to an emotionally healthy adult? What is the trajectory of going from point A to point B? And also, what causes divergent trajectories that may lead to risk? So, divergent trajectories that may lead to anxiety later in development, to depression. And there are various other trajectories that lead to negative outcomes. So, how do we get to these different trajectories? What's the normative trajectory of emotional development? And how do children diverge into pathways of risk? And I'm specifically interested in when does that happen? So when in development do those pathways diverge and why? What is the mechanism for that divergence? What causes some kids to be healthy, emotionally stable adults, and what leads to these divergent pathways. And I'm very, very specifically interested in fear and anxiety. What leads to pathways that lead to anxious children, anxious teenagers, anxious adults. And why do I care about anxiety? Well, anxiety is really, really common. Over 40 million adults, nearly 20% of the US population suffers from an anxiety disorder, and 5 to 10% of children suffer from an anxiety disorder. And anxiety is something that emerges early in development, certainly by adolescence, but oftentimes by preschool age. So this is why I specifically care about emotional development and how normative trajectories that lead to healthy emotional functioning, where do they diverge into risk for anxiety and fear? So let me just give you some definitions. What is fear? What are fear and anxiety? A normative fear is a reasonable response to an imminent threat that gets bigger when the threat is bigger and that gets smaller when the threat is smaller. A clinical fear or a phobia is a response to a stimulus that does not take the proximity of the threat into account. So it doesn't get bigger or smaller based on how threatening the situation is. It's just always intense. So the way I think about this is when people ask me, "Are you afraid of snakes?" I say, "Well, it depends." And it depends on how that snake is being presented to me. If you give me a harmless snake, I would be happy to touch it. I've touched snakes before. I've put them around my neck before. I'm happy to go into a reptile house at the zoo and look at all of the very, very cool large snakes. But if I was hiking in the woods and a large snake fell down off of a tree onto my shoulders, I would be afraid because I don't know what that snake is and whether it's threatening. So to me, whether or not I'm afraid of snakes depends on whether I'm in a threatening situation. For other people, it does not matter what the situation is. They are afraid of snakes no matter what. They will not go into a reptile house at the zoo, which is a place where you can see a snake in a very safe environment. They will not hold a harmless snake. They don't even like to look at photos of snakes. This is what we would call a phobia or a clinical fear. And how does this differ from anxiety? Well, fear is about something. It happens in the moment, right? And it can be intense. So fear is always about something very specific and it's brief and may vary in intensity, whereas anxiety lingers. So anxiety doesn't have to be about something specific, and it doesn't have to be in a specific moment. I call it a dispositional state or trait that makes us more reactive to potential threats. So what I mean by a dispositional state is I might be in an anxious state because something imminent is happening. Maybe I'm nervous about, the holiday season coming, or maybe I'm nervous about the state of the economy or the state of our government. That would be an anxious state. But there's also trait anxiety, and that's just about our baseline level of anxiety. And I'm sure you all know some of us are more anxious than others. I myself am on Lexapro for anxiety. So, and this is really, really common. Like, this is what an anxious trait means, that some of us are just, at different levels of anxiety in our lives. So what you'll notice about all of these definitions is that they're all about threat. So when we start to look at how we perceive threat, and how we perceive threat differently in different contexts. This is where we start when we want to study how we diverge into pathways of risk for anxiety. We really have to start with how we perceive and respond to threat, which I call threat perception. So, in the literature, researchers have studied this by looking at how quickly we detect threats in the environment, how much we will engage with threats in the environment, and likewise, how difficult it is for us to disengage from threatening stimuli, and the relation between this engagement, disengagement, rapid detection, and fear or anxiety. So, the classic view in the literature on threat perception and how it develops over time is that it's critical for survival. So, researchers for a long time have posited the most classic theories in the field suggest that we have mechanisms that we're born with, that we've inherited through evolutionary history to respond quickly, and efficiently to fears in the environment. And it goes something like this. They propose that we detect threat very quickly. This activates fear in the brain, and it leads to avoidance responses. And the idea is that this is something that's important for survival. So we have an evolved predisposition for the rapid detection of recurrent threats, threats that have a biological basis, that evolutionarily we have a historic reason to avoid these things. And according to this view, this system's activated automatically upon contact with a threat, and it's immune to cognitive influences and should be present early. It should be normative, so it should be something everybody has and should be stable across individuals. So, this is the first question I ever looked at in grad school, and I was really curious about whether this was true. And so, over time, I've studied evolutionary threats, meaning things that were, again, have this hypothesized evolutionary route where we should be afraid of them very early in life. Things like snakes and spiders, these are the two most common fears in the world. Fear of threatening conspecifics, illness or contagion, and things like heights and wide open spaces and the dark. So these are the kinds of things people have studied when they look at this literature. So you're going to see a lot of this in the studies we talk about today. But what's really interesting about this literature is there's this whole other literature, a clinical literature, that has a very different view of our reactions to threat. They think that an attention bias to threat, so attention to threat is linked to anxiety and cause it, not just that, but it's a potential causal mechanism for the development of anxiety. And that it's also a potential mechanism for the maintenance of anxiety. So if we're paying attention to these things in our environment that cause us anxiety, it's just going to make the anxiety get bigger and bigger and bigger. That's kind of the theory. So my question when I looked at this literature is like, which is it? Do we have these like sort of innate mechanisms to detect threats in our environment, or is it linked to fear and anxiety? So the main method that people use for this is a detection method. I adapted a standard detection method for use with children because I'm a developmental psychologist. So I need methodologies that will work with kids. So it's very, very simple. You see a child here. He's 5 or 6, and he's touching a flower on the screen, and he's detecting a flower amongst snake distractors. So basically, they see one target with 8 distractors, and they have to find it and touch it on the screen. And using this method over the years, I found that children and adults are really good at detecting threats. They detect snakes more quickly than flowers, frogs, and caterpillars. They detect spiders more quickly than mushrooms and cockroaches. And they detect threatening facial configurations like angry and fearful human faces more quickly than happy, neutral, and even sad faces that are also negative but not threat relevant. On top of that, researchers in Japan have used my touchscreen method to look at threat detection in Japanese monkeys, and they find the same results. Monkeys are really good at detecting snakes as well, faster than they are to detect other things like flowers. Um, so this so far really supports the evolutionary perspective, but we've also found that adults with snake and spider phobia detect the object of their fear even faster than non-phobic participants. So everybody detects snakes and spiders really quickly, but if you're afraid of them, you detect them even faster. And anxious adults and children with what we call behavioral inhibition. This is sort of the precursor to anxiety. Think of it as like a super shy or introverted child. These individuals by age 3 to 5 detect angry faces more quickly than non-anxious individuals. Not snakes, but angry faces, angry conspecifics, social stimuli. So individuals who have social anxiety detect social threats really fast. So, altogether, what this suggests is that humans are pretty well adapted to respond quickly to various threats early in life. These findings have been widely replicated, and what researchers say about the anxiety results is that anxiety just it just exacerbates our propensity to detect these things. So it's not that fear and anxiety cause us to detect these things more quickly. Fear and anxiety cause us to detect these things more quickly. It's not that we detect them more quickly because of fear and anxiety. So, reflecting on this literature, much of which I have produced, I, I, I was confused, if children are these sort of well-equipped animals to deal with threat in the environment, why do they do such dumb things? Now it's being oh, there you go. It's like kind of choppy, but babies do crazy, crazy dumb things, things that are incredibly dangerous. If you've ever been around a child, they have no problem grabbing a snake. They have no problem of diving off a large height. Why is it if they're so like ready to detect these things in the environment, why do they behave in ways that make them look so dumb? So, I wanted to know whether these detection studies are related to fear and anxiety at all. Because my experience was, yep, they detect these things all really quickly, but they don't seem to be afraid of threat at all. In fact, they seem to sort of lean into things that are threatening. And if you have children, you know what I'm talking about. So, I did a study looking at whether babies are afraid of snakes and spiders with real snakes and spiders. So, I did a 10-minute play session in the lab. Children first interacted with 4 toys and 4 animals alone for 5 minutes. So there were 4 very child popular toys in the middle of the room. And then there was a terrarium at each of the 4 walls. And the terrarium had a live betta fish, a live hamster, a live snake, and a live tarantula. And I just wanted to know, what do they do? Are they really afraid of these things? And after 5 minutes of hanging out with these things by themselves, their parents were invited to interact with them. So I thought, all right, well, if babies are these well-adapted machines to detect and avoid threat, they should avoid the snake and spider over the toys and over the other 2 animals. Um, that's what I thought, but this is what I saw.
Look, snake, snake, snake. A snake is there, Mommy. A snake is there.
We didn't see any avoidance or any evidence of fear in any of the children. It was literally zero. And in fact, what you're seeing here is that they preferred to interact with these animals over the toys significantly. They asked more questions about them. They talked to them more. And these animals were not that exciting. They were in these tiny terrariums. They were stuck to the wall. They couldn't actually interact with these things. The the tarantula didn't move, like could have actually just been dead because it didn't move at all. The corn snake did move. The hamster and the fish moved, but the hamster was also nocturnal and didn't move that much. So, what we saw was positive approach behaviors towards these animals. No negative affect, no negative emotion. And even in these detection studies, we don't see evidence of negative emotions. So maybe they have a perceptual bias to detect snakes, but not fear. Um, so this doesn't really sit well with me and the theory, but I did notice something that made my research take a turn, something in the parents. So while you saw that the kids were really, really excited about the snakes and spiders, this is what we saw from some of the parents. I want you to look at her face, her body language, and what she says.
Do you like that? Mhm.
Watch her body.
I think you show me the other things in here. You show me the other things. What else do you see?
So she's giving a lot of cues there that the snake is not something that the child should be interested in. So first she said, "Do you like that? Interesting. Don't get too close to that." So she's getting verbal input that suggests she should stay away from this thing. She's also getting physical input. So the mother sort of puts her hands on her daughter right away and sort of pulls her back and diverts her attention to the room. So this made me think, you know, is it really that we have a predisposition to be afraid of these things, or is there just input in the environment that drives us to some things and not others? So that made me start thinking about the role of input, the role of the emotional environment, and how it shapes biases to detect things and emotional behavior. So in developmental psychology, we usually think of what babies look at as a cue for what they know. So what's classic in this research is like we look at where babies gaze to figure out something about what they know about physical properties of objects, about the social properties of objects, and even about the emotions of objects. But one thing, emotions of others, I mean, but one thing that's true about input is that babies don't just look at the world passively. They direct their attention to input that they prefer, that they like, that they want to look at. So they might look longer at their mother's face than toys, or their mother's face than another face in the room. And what's also true is that the input that they get, the emotional input that they receive, is constrained by by the environment that they live in. So we all don't get the same emotional environment. We don't get the same home environment from one house to another. So, the question is, what does this input mean and how does it drive how they think and how they feel? So let's think about input in a very, very simple graphic. So there's input that infants receive. Then they use this input to make some kind of judgment about the world and plan their behavior. So far, we've talked about attentional biases as something that's just there and doesn't develop over time. But you can also imagine how these kinds of attentional biases might also change the emotional input that they get. So let's say you do have an attentional bias for a snake. You have a bias to detect snakes quickly, regardless if you're afraid of whether or not you're afraid of them. Okay, so that attentional bias is going to affect the input that infants see. So if you're biased to attend to snakes and spiders, you're more apt to process input about snakes and spiders. So if you're paying attention to those things, you're going to get more input about those things just because you're paying more attention. And what I found in my own research that I won't talk about today, but we can talk after if you want, that input is 100% let's say 90% likely to be negative. So if you're paying attention to these things, you're getting more input, and that input is negative, you're more likely to learn that snakes and spiders are bad, and you're more likely to fear snakes and spiders. And again, snake and spider fears are really, really common. What about in the case of behaviorally inhibited, shy, or anxious children? What you saw before is these children have a bias to look at more negative faces than positive faces. What that leads to is that the input that they're getting about the emotional world is more negative because they are paying more attention to negative faces than other kids. And what you see, the result of that is they're more likely to appraise ambiguous information as negative because it's a confirmation bias. They're used to seeing more things that are negative. So when they get neutral information, they're more likely than non-anxious children to interpret that information as negative. And what that eventually leads to is anxiety about social situations. But what I'm interested now is what if the input creates attention biases? So what about the environment, differences in the environment that could also create biased attention to certain kind of emotional stimuli? This could lead to a different kind of appraisal and then different behaviors. Now, we see this play out in the maltreatment literature. So, children who have been physically maltreated by their parents, these parents, we know from the literature, express more anger than other parents. So, what I'm saying is physically abusive parents tend to express more anger than non-physically abusive parents. And what's interesting about these parents is they also are less expressive overall of other emotions. So these parents express a lot of anger and they express less variability in the rest of their emotional repertoire. What you see over time with children of these abusive parents is they over perceive the presence of anger in emotional displays. In other words, they might interpret other negative emotions, sadness in the case of the study I've cited here, as angry. Um, they also aren't so good at discriminating non-angry emotions. So this follows exactly from the input they're getting from the parents. The parents express more anger, the children become really hyper attentive to anger and they tend to over perceive anger. They sort of like get really, really there's a high false alarm rate. Well, they'll interpret other things as angry. And they're not so good at discriminating these other emotions that the parents are not so good at expressing. What happens over time is they interpret ambiguous emotions as angry because, again, they're over perceiving anger. They want to be really hyper on top of anger because it's likely that anger is going to result in some kind of maltreatment. And eventually, these children who interpret ambiguous emotions as angry are more aggressive. Why? Because they interpret other emotions as anger and they react aggressively. So, my question is, what about if there's anxiety in the environment or there's other stressors in the environment like poverty? How does this affect the way children attend to emotions and then make appraisals about emotions and then have emotional behavior? And again, this is happening over time at different time points. And the children's responses, emotional responses to the input in their environment will then change the emotional environment, right? So if you have a child who's really, really sensitive to anger and they freak out every time they see an angry expression, that's going to affect the way that what's in the environment, what's there for the parents, how the parents respond to this, how the siblings respond, etc. And of course, all of these stimuli are present in their environment at the same time. So how do these things interact over time? So, this caused me to take a more developmental view of threat perception and really ask what is happening? How does attention to threat and other emotions develop over time? And how does it diverge? But we don't have a lot of longitudinal data with babies. We mostly have data with preschool age and up, which they've had years to develop an understanding of other people's emotions by then. And we don't know when attention, we know that children and adults are biased to detect threats in the environment, but we don't know how that develops. The classic view would suggest it's always been there, but we don't know if that's the case. Um, and are there normative responses that diverge into individual differences? And how do they relate to specific experiences like having stress in the environment? So, to take a stab at this, I ran a longitudinal study with babies, a group of 359 babies. They were collected at 3 sites, and we brought them in 5 times at 4 months, 8 months, 12 months, 18 months, and 24 months. And we had lots and lots of measures. I'm not going to go over all of them because there are so many, but I'll say we had threat detection and disengagement and engagement tasks using an eye tracker, and we had a whole slew of parent report measures of stress and anxiety. So the two tasks that are most relevant are these two. First is a baby version of our threat detection task, where babies see a fun video in the middle of the screen, and then a threatening face or an angry face, a happy face, or a neutral face appears in one of the four corners of the screen, and we just measure how long does it take them to find it. Um, then we have an overlap task to measure engagement and disengagement. So for this task, they see a video again to get their attention to the middle of the screen. Then we show them in the center of a screen, either a happy, an angry, or a neutral face for 1 second. Then after 1 second, and we measure they're looking at the face, a checkerboard probe appears to the left or the right of the face at the same time. So that's why we call it overlap, because it overlaps with the face. And we want to know how difficult it is it for them to look away from the face to find this checkerboard. And we measured this at 5 time points to see how attention, detection, engagement, and disengagement from threat, what does it look like over time? And we find that it is not there at birth. It develops over time as children are learning what emotional facial expressions mean. So, what you're seeing here, the angry face is in red, the happy face is in green, and the neutral face is in black. But what you're going to see here and on this right here is latency to detect the face. So, lower numbers mean faster. What I want you to see is that overall, detection of these faces speeds up over time. So they get better and better at this task over time, which is why this latency goes down from 4 months to 12 months. But they get faster at angry faces faster over time, meaning that they get better at angry faces more quickly. And by 12 months, there's a distinct bias to more quickly detect angry faces than happy and neutral faces. So the bias to detect threatening faces is not there at 4 months. In fact, you see they're pretty much all the same here, happy, angry, and neutral at 12 months. It isn't until 18 and 24 months that you see that they have a distinct bias to detect angry faces faster. And at 18 and 24 months is when they start to use facial expressions to guide what they do. There's evidence that at 18 and 24 months, babies are learning what these faces mean. So it's not surprising that as they learn what they mean, they detect angry or threatening signals more quickly. We see parallel results with the overlap task. So this is looking to the face, how long they look at the face. So longer looking at the face means a more difficult time switching to the probe. What you see here is they're actually not looking at the angry face. They look at the angry face for less time than the happy and the neutral, but this switches over time. Where over time they are engaging more with angry faces and they are having more difficulty disengaging from faces, and we see a distinct bias to engage more and more difficulty disengaging from angry faces by 24 months. What's interesting about this is we see a different trajectory when we add stress variables to the picture. So when we start looking at how this normative trajectory interacts with parental report of stress, we see something very different. So what I'm going to show you on this graph is the vigilance task, but I've broken it down by 3 levels of maternal report of household stress. So this is normative household stress, like how annoying are my kids? How many hassles do I have to deal with today? So what you see here, 1.5 right here is 1.5 standard deviations above the mean. So these are babies of moms who report more stress in the household. This blue line is the mean, and this negative 1.5 line, this orange line, is moms who report fewer hassles. These are moms who report less stress. What you see over time is for these two lines, the normative amounts of hassles and stress versus the low amounts, is they mirror what you see in the other graph. They are getting faster over time. But what you see with the babies of moms who are stressed is they actually get slower to detect angry faces over time. Not what we expected. Now, when you take the entire we use this person-centered approach, which is sort of like a reverse factor analysis if you're familiar with the factor analysis. We took both tasks now and we identified what we tried to do is look to see if there were individuals who showed the same patterns of responding. So of those 359 babies, do some babies show the same pattern of responding across both tasks versus other babies? And we actually found two distinct profiles. So here you're going to see the overlap task, but we've actually saw two distinct profiles. One, the normative profile, where babies get faster at detecting emotions over time and they engage more and have more difficulty disengaging over time. So this is engagement right here. This is the normative class one. This blue line are the normative babies where they're engaging more with all emotional faces over time. But these babies in green, we saw a second pattern of responding. There's a group of babies who show the opposite pattern. They get slower at detecting angry faces over time, and they engage less and less and less with all emotions, particularly angry emotions over time. And what's interesting about this group has significantly more maternal anxiety than the other one. So these are the babies that have moms that are anxious. So just to summarize that for you, we found two different developmental trajectories here. The normative trajectory, the one that most of the infants fit in, where attention biases develop over time, and that for faces, they get faster over time at detecting emotional faces, especially threatening ones, and they look longer at them. They have a more difficult time looking away from them. But for anxious and stress moms, they get slower over time to detect angry faces, and they look less at emotional faces over time than in if they have anxious mothers. So, what does this mean? What does this tell me about attention to emotion? First, um, it tells me that attention biases are learned through experience. They are not there at birth. They develop over time with understanding of what the stimulus is. It's not necessarily linked to fear, but if it's persistent or habitual, it's very possible that it can lead to anxiety, especially since what we're seeing is it's the babies of anxious mothers that are having this other kind of developmental trajectory. So this is when my research sort of switched from looking at how attention biases relate to anxious behavior to how the emotional input of the environment relates to behavior. And again, we found that anxiety and stress in mothers leads to diverging pathways of not just threat perception, but emotion perception. But this is an indirect link, right? Like we don't actually know what the moms are doing. We just know that when moms say they're anxious, they have babies who are slower to find emotional faces over time and engage less with emotional faces over time. So what is happening? What is the direct link here? And what we think is that these mothers are doing something or they're behaving in a way that is changing the way infants are coming to perceive emotions. So, what do we know from the literature? We know from the literature that anxious mothers are less sensitive to their infants' needs. They are less emotionally responsive to their infants, and they're more interfering when the infants need something. They're sort of more like on top of their infants. So, the question is, But these are, again, this is from studies where parents are reporting this. We're not actually looking at mothers' behaviors. So, what we want to know is what is the emotional input that babies are getting from their moms, and how does this change the way they perceive emotions? So, this is what I'm studying right now. So, my research questions are in a real ongoing stream of behavior. What do infants actually see in their emotional environments? What is the input? What is the normative emotional input that they see in their environments? And how does this vary for moms who are anxious, depressed, um, who live in poverty, who have chaotic households? How does this vary from household to household? So, what we're doing is we're putting eye trackers on moms and babies, and we're having them play with each other. And what we want to know is what are the emotions that they see? Now, according to the classic sort of evolutionary literature, is that there are a certain group of facial expressions, facial signals that are universal and that every baby sees in their environment. And this includes, these are the basic emotions, the emotions we all have experience with anger, fear, disgust, surprise, happiness, and sadness. But other researchers have suggested that there are other basic emotions, lots more than that, including amusement, boredom, confusion, a whole sort of list. So, what we've decided is to hand code for all of them. So, what we're doing right now is we're bringing 120 babies into the labs with their caregivers. They're tested at 6, 9, and 12 months, 3 times. And both of the parent and the baby are wearing eye trackers so that we can see what they see, what each of them see, during a free play task, during a test where they're not allowed to touch a certain toy, because we're including this because moms are usually on their best behavior when they come into the lab. We want to see how they deal with negative emotions in the babies, telling them they can't do something and seeing how they respond when the babies don't like that. And then some very typical things like diaper changing and feeding. So typical interactions between moms and babies. And then we have a bunch of emotion perception tasks, just like the vigilance task and overlap task that I just showed you, to see how what babies see relates to how they come to perceive emotions over time. Now, we just started the study, so I don't have data for you on how the anxious moms and non-anxious moms differ. But I do have a very interesting tidbit of preliminary data that I can share with you. So, to sort of develop this study, we coded a freely available data set where moms and babies were just interacting in their homes, 44 moms and babies over time. And this is from somebody else. This was collected at Duke. So we are just recoding their data for emotional information. They were also transcribed. So what the mom and the baby were saying during these interactions was transcribed. And these individuals collected this data from 6 to 17 months, 1 hour at home, mom interacting with baby once a month between 6 and 17 months. We bin them to make it a lot easier. This is a very heavy coding burden. So we lumped the 6 to 9 period together, the 9 to 12, to the 12 to 15, and the 15 to 17. We coded when a face was available, a full or partial face, and then we used the facial action coding system called FACS to identify specific facial movements that correspond to all the basic emotions I showed you. And we transcribed their motion language. So here's just a little tidbit of what we found. Again, in the literature, the evolutionary literature assumes that emotional information is learned by being exposed to these very basic emotions. However, we saw very little evidence that moms actually express these basic emotions. So if you look at this, these are the instances of fear, disgust, sadness, anger. So we saw lots of happiness, but we're not seeing a lot of the basic emotions. In other words, when moms express fear, they don't like make that stereotypical like big eyes and open mouth fear expression that we were coding for. Their actual emotions look very different. And when you look at how we code it, so this is all of these other emotions. What you notice, we see some happiness, we see some interest, but look at the means for these other basic emotions. We're just not seeing them. What we're seeing is this category other, where their emotional facial expressions don't fit neatly into any of these basic emotion categories that we've thought of. So what we did is we tried to recreate the most common facial configurations that babies saw. We used a very complicated process that I'm not going to describe to you in detail, but basically we used modeling to pull out the most common facial expressions that we saw across moms and across time. And this is what we saw. What you're going to notice, you see some positive affect here, but these are really ambiguous, right? They're really ambiguous faces. They probably are tagging something as important, but this leaves so much room for variability in what the parents are actually going to express. So that's what we're looking for now. So, as a quick conclusion, because I'm already over, what does this all mean? It means that we really need to pay attention to maternal anxiety and depression, which up to 1 in 5 women experience anxiety and depression postpartum, and these numbers are only growing. Um, and what we've learned from my research is that, having an anxious mom means having a different trajectory of emotion understanding. And this starts between 4 and 24 months of age. And this is really important because anxiety and depression in children is predicted by anxiety and depression in caregivers. So the question is, how does this happen? How does maternal anxiety and depression then, lead to these diverging pathways of emotion understanding that may predict the children themselves developing these instances of anxiety, depression when they're adults? So there are many ways that this can be transmitted. One is through epigenetics. So I don't want to give a big epigenetics lesson, but epigenetics is basically changes in gene expression um, without changes in DNA. They are reversible and they begin before birth. It's a normal part of development. But epigenetics prenatally, so what the mother experiences prenatally, can have profound effects on the fetus. And not just in what she eats, but also uh, as the result of stress. So here's just a few examples. Here's one that this is the most common example is the Dutch famine example. This happened between 1944 and 1945 in World War II, where the Nazis blocked off all food supplies to the Netherlands, and everyone in the country experienced famine. Uh, so there's all of these research looking at the effects of malnourishment during these times. So they looked at specifically their research on moms who were pregnant during this time. And there were changes in the babies who had these mothers who were pregnant that lasted for generations. Namely, what happened is when the mothers were pregnant and they were in a famine, basically what their bodies were projecting to their babies is that food is limited. So this baby is going to be born into an environment where food resources are limited. And what happens is the biology of the mother, this fetus is being programmed to take advantage of every calorie. These babies are born, the famine ended. And what happened? Something very, very counterintuitive, whereas the babies who that had pregnant moms during the Dutch famine are more likely to them and their children were more likely to be obese, more likely to develop heart disease, and more likely to die of heart attacks. So what's happening here is these bodies are being trained because of what the mother is experiencing prenatally to take advantage of every calorie, and they were basically born into an environment where that wasn't necessary. The famine was over and they had persistent problems. The same things happen with stress. So the maternal stress and maternal stress hormones affect the environment of the fetus. So through what we call fetal programming, and what you see is that there are more stress hormones in the prenatal environment. That fetus is preparing for an environment that is high in threat relevance. And what happens is these babies have a range of negative outcomes. There are physical ones, there are cognitive attentional ones, but the emotional ones, one is that they seem to be more primed to detect threat. So this can also happen environmentally. There are associations, for example, between paid maternal leave and infant brain function. So 3-month-old infants of mothers with paid leave have more mature brain profiles than babies who had mothers who had to go back to work. And so this is all to suggest that we need to help moms. Like identification of anxiety and depression in mothers, especially while pregnant and postpartum in the first 2 years of life, is essential for dealing with this. And we need public policies that support new moms, that support their emotional stability, especially during these years. Because their emotions, they are setting the and when I say moms, I just mean the primary caregiver. It could be dads. This is always studied in moms because guess what? Moms are the ones that bring their babies into the lab. So, where we're going with this is really to push support for mothers, especially postpartum, prenatally, because what we're seeing is these effects start 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. We already see effects of this emotional environment on the way babies process emotions. So, if you taking home anything that I say today, it's that the emotional environment of the child really depends on the emotional environment of the mom and the dad and whoever is in the home. And if we want to help babies, we have to help moms. Okay, that's it. And I went way more than 30 minutes.
This was fascinating, Vanessa. Thank you so much. I'm sure that I speak for myself and for others. I have learned tremendously a lot. And it's saddening as well to see the profound effect of um, the things that you're studying and the little policy implications and the little policy support that they end up getting. We have one question from the audience.
Yeah, so the question is how much of inherited
Yes.
PTSD can be addressed in babies and children? What is the ideal age to generally address anxious pattern in babies and toddlers? That's what we're trying to find out. So this research is really, really new. We don't have a lot, you know, we don't even know what the anxious mother's behaviors are and how that's getting transmitted. What I think is happening, my hypothesis is that these moms are just really inconsistent in their emotional responding. So, what babies learn is that the mother's emotions don't predict anything consistently, so they
Mhm.
stop paying attention over time. Because what are emotions for? They're supposed to help us figure out what to expect next. So, I don't know when the ideal age to intervene is. I would say we want to make sure that moms are okay when they're pregnant and in the next year at the very, very least. Um, how much inherit that's not to say it can't be addressed in babies. That's what epigenetics is, right? Like you can turn these genes on and off. So I would argue that if the mother, sometimes maternal stress prenatally is much harder to control because she can't be on certain medications. There's only so much you can do when you're pregnant. But I think intervening when the baby's born, providing support for depression. Postpartum depression is so common, and so is postpartum anxiety. My husband and I always reflect on our first child and how anxious we were after that first pregnancy, where that just sort of dissipated after the second. First time moms and dads need support, or moms and moms, or dads and dads, whatever the environment is, they need support. The caregivers need support. And I personally think that we don't think about that. We're thinking about like, oh, the babies, we need to, but sometimes the best way to intervene for the baby is to provide support for the mom.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Vanessa, for this fascinating for such a fascinating presentation and for such a thoughtful talk. I also want to thank all of you for being here and for your questions and for your presence. It is your energy that makes these events and these conversations meaningful. We will be continuing this series each month. Our next event is titled Rutgers Accessible Disability, the Built-in Environment and Intersectionality. The event will take place on October 3rd, and it is co-sponsored with disability studies. I hope that you will join us. I hope that you will keep bringing your curiosity and your voice into the room. Again, on behalf of Women and Gender Studies program, thank you so much, Professor LoBue, for your fascinating conversation and for your fascinating research. And thanks, everyone.